their fourth album that caught a lot of attention. And their fifth album was Hotel California. So by the age of 28, they were superstars. So this is a case in which innovation happened much faster. So one of the big questions in sort of research on creativity and innovation is, why is it that in some cases innovation happens very quickly, and in some cases innovation happens very, very slowly? So this is what they look like today. And it was actually a great pleasure and privilege for me to actually surprise my friend Shyam Kothari, who's not with us today. He was visiting Chicago in 2013. He was there for a board of trustees meeting at Northwestern. And he said, Ram, let's get together for dinner. I said, no, I got some other plans for you. He said, what's it? I said, I won't tell you. So he came back to the hotel. I said, we're going somewhere. Be there by 6:30. So we got into the car. He kept saying, where are we going? I said, I won't tell you, but let's go there. We're going to the United Center. So he said, are we going to see a basketball game? Yes, sir. We walked in there. There was, and he heard, I think it was Life in the Fast Lane. That was a song from one of their albums. So this is what they look like. And so for them, success came very, very early. So here's a sort of broad set of questions that have been analyzed. What is creativity? There are lots of books about this. Who creates? Can one tell ex ante who is a creator, who is an innovator? When are people most creative? Now there's even stuff on what period in the day you're going to be more creative. There's a book most recently by Daniel Pink. The title of the book is called When. When should you be doing things? And so on. Why do people create? By this I mean, what is the narrative? What is your internal logic for why you want to be an innovator? Okay? And then finally, how does age contribute to creativity? These are among the questions that have been analyzed over the course of the 20th century and the 21st century. Let me give you a synopsis of what people have found. So this is from a book by Howard Lehman. This is actually published in the 1950s, but this is a summary of what people thought about creativity. In the West, quite possibly everywhere. Here's a quote. He says, genius does not function equally well throughout the years of adulthood. Superior creativity rises relatively rapidly to a maximum, which occurs usually in the 30s and then falls off. So this idea was that creativity is the monopoly of the young. And once you hit some point, that's it, it's over. You don't have anything more to draw from. So this is one view. Here's another quote that tells us a lot about how creativity, how experience can actually be a liability. Here's what Lehman says. When a situation requires a new way of looking at things, the acquisition of new techniques or even new vocabularies, they all seem stereotyped. I want to tell you about this guy who's actually a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago. His name is David Gallancy. I don't know him, at least I don't know him well. Here's a picture of him. He sort of was doodling, going around exploring. Here's what he did. Sometime about in the early 2000s, he decided that what he was going to do was to study art. I don't mean study art from an aesthetic standpoint, but to sort of study the economics of art. Here's what he wanted to do. He wanted to understand market prices for pieces of art, especially famous works of art. And so what he did was he went to this manual, I think it's called, it's a Swiss manual, that tracks the price of every piece of art produced by a major painter. And he cataloged it and he sat and stared at it. In particular, what he was interested in doing was he wanted to compute and he wanted to analyze this thing called the age-price ratio. Meaning he wanted to understand what is the relationship between the price of a piece of art and the age at which that piece of art was conceived. Okay? So that's what he set out to do, to try and understand this price-age ratio or age-price ratio. In addition, what he wanted to understand was what he calls attitudes and artistic practices. That is, what was the artist's goal? What was his or her methodology? How was he or she trying to innovate? So this is what he set out to do. In the process, what he ended up doing was creating what we might think of as an empirical understanding of the life cycle of creativity. Okay? So until his time, most of the study of art was in aggregates, so that we pooled everybody together, and many of the studies were anecdotal. We didn't really have any clear sense of an overall picture of what was going on. I want to start with one of the subjects of his study, Pablo Picasso. Okay, so Picasso was a young man, he had moved to Paris. This is a picture of him in Paris pretty early in his life. I'm thinking 1906 or thereabouts. 1906 was his breakthrough year. So, what Galenson discovered actually, what set him to sort of really dig deeply into this, was he found something very interesting. That Picasso actually lived till he was 92. Picasso produced enormous volumes of art. But his most expensive and his most deeply appreciated art were all produced when he was in his early 20s. So this price to age ratio, imagine on the vertical axis you have price, and on the horizontal axis you have age. As he's aging, the price of his art was falling. There was a declining function. And the early works were 4 times as expensive as his later works. So that's what he discovered. So his most expensive piece of art, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907. Okay, so what is very, very noteworthy for me, and I've hung around with Sonu for many, many decades, and a little bit of that influence has rubbed off. But what is actually interesting for me is his attitude, his idea, his thoughts on what innovation constituted. So here's something that I found striking. Here's a quote. This is actually revolutionary, because until Picasso came along, you were trying to depict reality as it was. He says, I paint objects as I think them, not see them. That tells us a little bit about his model of innovation, his model of creativity. So here's his philosophy. This is also epitomized by this rooster, which is a very famous piece of work for him. He planned his paintings in advance. It wasn't something accidental. It wasn't something that he stumbled upon. It was something he actually thought about a lot. For instance, this Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, he had 400 preparatory drawings. So he was planning this. It was a tactical kind of thing. And he intended it to be a masterpiece. That tells us a little bit about his model and his ideas on how he innovates. What's also noteworthy as you look through his life is that many critics have noted that he changed styles frequently. Or as he noted here in a quote, whenever I had something to say, I said it in the manner in which I have felt it ought to be said. Entirely, let me call it practical. He's willing to change. That tells you about his model of innovation. So here's a critic's view of Picasso. There was not one Picasso, but 10, 20, always different. And in this, he was the opposite of Cézanne, whose work followed that logical, reasonable course of fruition. So one thing I want you to keep in mind, Picasso's price-age profile, downward sloping function. All his most valuable piece of work was done when he was young, and he lived till 92. I want to give you that contrast with Cézanne. Now, Cézanne actually died about the time Picasso was putting together Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. So here's a picture of Cézanne, and here's his most famous piece of work. And this is actually what got Galenson going, because Galenson observed that Cézanne's most valuable pieces of work were all produced when he was in his 60s. And his most expensive piece of work was produced when he was 67, the year of his death. Okay, so what about the price-age profile? Work done in his 60s was 17 times more valuable than the work he did when he was in his 20s. Reverse, it's an upward sloping function. So if you aggregate, you lose a lot. You need to disaggregate and look almost individually. What do we know about Cézanne's philosophy? First thing that's noteworthy is that he pursued a single, what you might call ambiguous goal. And what was this goal? Make Impressionism as solid and lasting as the old masters. I want you to keep this in mind. Because if you have a vague goal, you don't quite know where you're going. In contrast, Picasso knew precisely what he wanted to do. Okay, and then he moved on. That was it for him. Okay, so something more about Cézanne's philosophy. This is actually a piece of work he did on and on, repeatedly. And here's what he said. These are again quotes attributed to him that tells us a little bit about his style. He says, in order to make progress, there's only nature. And he decided he needed to immerse himself in it. And he says, to get this knowledge, it can only be acquired through very long experience. So he went on iterating, repeatedly, never quite knowing whether he had done what he set out to do. Okay. So here's a critic's view of Cézanne. For him, as I understood his work, the ultimate synthesis of a design was never revealed in a flash. Rather, he approached his books, and it's almost as if he knew what he wanted to write and wrote it, about this character who was in a war, World War I, but he was a deserter. He was in love, but his mistress died. And at the end of the book, it's very clear, life is a big struggle. In the end, humans are going to lose. It's his message. He gave that with clarity. Okay? So there are many others who were like him, early stars, Herman Melville, who wrote one good book. That's it. When he was 32, Moby Dick. Okay? Or D.H. Lawrence. Remarkably, D.H. Lawrence died, as you can see, when he was still a pretty young man. When he wrote his famous book, Sons and Lovers, when he was 28 years old. Okay? So you find almost even in literature, writers who start early, and in many cases that's the only thing that they've done. I want to show you now stuff from the movies, examples of the movies. Great example of this is Orson Welles, who produced Citizen Kane, considered by many to be the single greatest movie in the 20th century, by the critics and by others. Almost every decade they ask critics to decide what's the best movie in the 20th century. They keep saying Citizen Kane. And Orson Welles produced this movie when he was still a very young man. He was 26 years old. He knew what he wanted to do. This Citizen Kane, Charles Kane, was continually portrayed from different angles. He innovated a different way of showing a person. For the viewer, it was almost like that there wasn't one Charles Kane, but many, many Charles Kanes. This was his single greatest achievement. And people have asked Orson Welles, Orson Welles, how did you do this? What made this all possible? And he said, ignorance. Okay. That's often the hallmark of a conceptual innovator. Doesn't know enough. George Martin, who was a record producer for the Beatles, said one of the reasons why Paul McCartney innovated so much was he had no formal training in music. No traditions to break. He just simply did whatever seemed right to him. Okay? So there are many others. Steven Spielberg, who produced E.T. at 36. Jean-Luc Godard, who produced Breathless at 30, which is actually in some ways a very confusing movie, but it's a revolutionary movie. So now let me show you late bloomers in the movies. Classic example is Alfred Hitchcock, who continually and incrementally innovated. Notice one more thing. His movies were not about ideas, his movies are about real people. Okay. And so what he wanted to do was continually probe human psychology, things like fear, insecurity, and so on. So his famous movie, Vertigo, was produced when he was 59. Take a look at Clint Eastwood, who's actually improving each year. Okay, Unforgiven, a movie that he directed when he was 62, or Martin Scorsese, who also produced The Departed when he was 64. So I'm saying that in almost every discipline you have people who are conceptual innovators and those who are late bloomers. I want to take you back to physics, show you how much physics has changed. These are the faces of all the Nobel Prize winners over the last couple of years. Okay. All these guys won their Nobels in their 60s and 70s for work they did in their 40s. What's changed in physics is physics has become much more experimental. Okay? Or even when there's conceptual or theoretical contributions, it takes a long time to verify it, to figure out whether this stuff is really, really important. Okay? So even physics has changed. A lot more emphasis now on prior and foundational knowledge. As in my example of Heisenberg, classical electromagnetics was not relevant. Therefore, he could just go out and do whatever he wanted. Whereas now in physics today, you've got to spend 10 years mastering an art. Imagine, for instance, you want to learn the sitar. You're going to be a good player when you're maybe 50, after you've slogged for about 30 years. Right? So one of the other questions I posed was, why? That is, what is the narrative? Why is it that people, conceptual innovators, the way they innovate the way they do, and late bloomers innovate the way they do? So there's this book by Charles Tilly that appeared about 10 years ago. Let your faith in. If someone is going to come and say to you, I want to start a business, you know, I'm going to get together with some smart guys and we'll start a business. We'll figure it out. Are you going to fund him or her? Are you going to fund someone else who comes up with a business plan that says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go and solve this problem. We think we can come up with this drug or this product, and here's our market. It's the latter that's much more compelling, even if it's quite often the case that this latter explanation is completely fictitious. Okay? But that's the way the world has been moving towards. We want someone to give us a technical explanation. And someone gives us a convention or tradition. No, not quite there, you're making it up. Okay? So, I want to show you about what's happening in the world of business as well. So, I mean, you look at some of the early innovators, conceptual innovators. Steve Jobs started Apple when he was 21 years old. Okay? I look at the others here. Bill Gates also started when he was 20. And Mark Zuckerberg when he was 20. So it might seem, if you look at any of these business journals today, it looks like all these guys in tech are young guys. That's what it seems. You need to be a young guy to be an entrepreneur and a successful one. If you're old, you can't do it. Sort of the implicit message you get from journals and magazines. Empirical evidence shows that that is absolutely false. I'm going to show you that evidence in a minute. And then you look at late bloomers in business. I mean, all of you know about the story of Muhammad Yunus, who was a professor in an economics department in the United States, decided to go back to Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, post-independence, post-famine, he decided he would go out there and see what was happening. And he says in his memoirs or in his books that, you know, actually the people taught him economics. He decided that it's actually, the very poor are actually creditworthy. And what he did with Grameen has become a model that's been emulated across the world. He started his company, well, it's a not-for-profit, social business as he puts it, when he was 43 years old. Look at this guy, Armancio Ortega, who is the third richest man in the world, I believe. He started Zara when he was 35. Actually, he became a billionaire only when he was 60 years old. Okay. There are many other examples of entrepreneurs who slogged for decades before they became successful. Here's a third one, Harlan Sanders, who started Kentucky Fried Chicken when he was 62. And he had many, many failures along the way. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that there are lots of successful entrepreneurs who start late. I want to show you this empirical evidence on the 21st century entrepreneur. Here's what we know. This is very interesting. This popular perception, as I said, is that the successful entrepreneur, especially in technology, is an old guy. He's a young guy, sorry. But here's a recent study, actually published this month. A study of 2.7 million fast-growing startup firms in the United States. This is over this period, 07 to 14. What's the average age of the successful startup founder? The average age of the successful startup founder is 42. So for every 1,000, if you look at the top firm, that is the top 0.01%, the founder of that firm is 45 years old. This is empirical evidence. It's not just the cover of a magazine here. The probability of starting a high-growth firm rises with age. That's what we see in the evidence, which means experience matters. And founders in their 20s have the lowest likelihood of a successful exit. Okay? That's what we're seeing. So prior experience in the industry seems to be a big asset. Okay? It increases the likelihood of success. Firms started by females, the evidence shows, are more likely to succeed than firms started by males. Okay? Again, the sample is small, but it's growing. So this is the 21st century entrepreneur. I want to come back to firms. I want us to think about innovation and models of innovation. Thus far, I've talked to you about the conceptual innovator and the experimental innovator. Let's think about firms. What kind of innovators are they? Now, if you think of Apple, we all know about, you know, the Apple Macintosh, the iPod, the iPhone. All of their innovations have been breakthrough innovations. That's what they aim for. The organization as its people, its architecture, its routines, and its culture, they're all geared towards this breakthrough innovation, big innovations. And I think that's part of the legacy of Steve Jobs, is that this is what they're oriented towards. This is what they see as their mission. So then you look at a company like Toyota. I actually got this from their webpage. This is what they consider innovation. Now, Toyota and the Japanese think of innovation very differently. First of all, it's a very, very long process. It's like, let's sit and think about this. How do we improve this car? How can we make it safer? How can we increase space? How can we improve quality and reduce costs? Okay? They have a very different view of innovation. They're experimental innovators. This organization is structured to be an experimental innovator. Slow, incremental movements. And society and the world has benefited greatly from this form of innovation. So, I'm going to show you some more evidence on who innovates and why by referring to a very, very interesting study, again, 2018 study of patent innovation in Sweden. Now, tells you a little bit about what research is like these days, that these three guys, or three guys, ask this question: what influences an individual's capacity to innovate? What are the variables that matter? And what they proceeded to do was to study the entire Swedish population. In other words, every single person in Sweden, they know a lot about him or her, where he or she was born, where he or she went to school, high school, where he or she went to college, if they did. Who else was in the class? At least who else was an innovator who was in the class? When they received the patent, if they did, and so on. So they looked at the sample of people born between 1955 and 1975 and focused on the people who received the patent in the years 2002 to 2007. So then they asked this question: if you received a patent, what could explain why you received a patent? Let's go back and see where you went to school. Do you by any chance go to school with some other guy who also received a patent? Did you live in Stockholm, or were you living in Malmo or in Gothenburg? And what they decided to do was to start and see what are some of the other variables that matter. And here's what they found. So, place of birth and place of higher education have significant positive influence on the likelihood of being an innovator, on the likelihood of being awarded a patent. Okay, so when you think about place of birth, the child doesn't choose that. That's what we call exogenous. Maybe the parents did, but it's exogenous. So there's something going on in where you were born that seems to matter. That means, of course, that this takes into account, what your parents, the influence that they have on you, the educational level of the mother, of the father, the environment around you, and so on. Place of high school does not seem to exert as high an influence as the place where you went to college. And then finally, educational background of parents, especially the mother, matters a lot in terms of the kind of innovator you become. Okay? So let me sort of close with some final thoughts, and then we'll have Q&A. So people, as much as disciplines, matter in terms of influencing the nature of innovation. It's not just that in physics you have only young people, and in arts there are older people. Very much depends upon the kind of innovator you are. And we've seen throughout history that you've got innovators of all kinds. So conceptual innovators and experimental innovators, this is Gallinson's contribution to the way we should think about innovation. Now I know it's nice, easy and convenient to say that there's this or this, maybe there's more than just two types, but we're seeing here a contrast in the way people innovate. Okay? Creativity does not always favor the young. In fact, in almost all disciplines today, experience matters a lot. Okay? And if you look at entrepreneurship, you find a lot of firms being founded by people in their 70s today. Successful firms started by people in their 70s. There's a high value period of productivity in every human's life. I gave this talk recently and someone asked, wasn't Da Vinci productive throughout his life? Maybe he was. But much after his life, we can look at the evidence and say, there was this episode in his life when his work was appreciated the most. Now, for economists, we look at some signal like prices. Okay? So there is this high value period. Unfortunately, we don't know it when we are in it, because only somebody else decides that, the marketplace perhaps. Then finally, let me end on this note. Quality often depends on quantity. Some of the great artists, whether you're musicians, whether you're painters, whether you're writers, wrote a lot. They composed a lot of music. They painted a lot. The Rolling Stones, it turns out, produced a lot of duds. So producing a lot may be the key to producing a lot of good stuff. Thank you. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
The last one really impressed me. Quality depends on quantity. It's not a question. I come to my question later. I totally agree. This is art. With respect to art, you are explaining this. But I am a photographer also. A Shutterstock quantity. But I strongly believe in this because I take a lot of snaps, take a lot of photographs, and out of which a few come out as the extremely good ones. So the quantity really matters.
Thank you. That's a good point. You have to write a lot of junk papers to produce a good one. One of the professors at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, Eugene Farmer, won a Nobel Prize, famously said, "I produce a lot of junk."
So which in turn supports experimental innovators, right? They do everything by trial and error.
They do. The conceptual innovators can also be very prolific. So they also produce a lot of stuff. What I found quite interesting about Picasso is that he actually said, "This is going to be my masterpiece." And it turned out to be true.
Out of so many.
Out of many. He planned it. Okay? But how could he have known that this is in fact what would be a masterpiece? Because he doesn't decide that. So that's quite noteworthy. Other comments, questions?
Is it possible for an older person to be a conceptual innovator? When you said they tend to be young, but
They tend to be. I mean, that's the empirical observation. But if you're a person about ideas, you could be a conceptual innovator at any age in life, right? But your breakthrough innovations, what we've observed, are the ones that happen early in your life. That's what we observe empirically.
Ram,
Yes, Vivek.
what does your research tell you on how we, regular folks like in this room, how we can be more creative?
First of all, I think, somebody once, one of my aunts told me, we non-creative people, I said, I don't think there's anything like that. Though it is definitely true that at any point in time, in any generation, only a few people will leave their mark on history. That's for sure, we know that. But every person contributes in some perhaps important way. You think about all the innovations at Apple and many companies today, the innovation happens in teams of people. So we don't see the individual, but some small individual is contributing in a significant way. I would say one thing to take away from some of my examples here is, you have to persist. You have to slog. It's okay not to know where you're going. It's okay. You can't always know it. And you have to produce a lot of duds before you produce some great stuff. And a lot of people fear that. A lot of people fear writing bad stuff or producing bad stuff because they think their reputations will go. Think about you're a musician. You're going to produce bad stuff. Even the Beatles produce bad stuff.
So, what is the place of confidence, self-confidence, in amongst both these two categories, experimental?
Without a doubt, there is self-confidence matters. Cezanne didn't have much throughout his life. I think that's noteworthy. He didn't have it. He never thought he did anything significant. And as is true with many others, they left their imprint for the rest of us. Jane Austen became very famous after her death, much after her death, 150 years after her death. Okay, so there's no telling. I think in the end, it's a slog. And each one of us has to absorb the evidence and decide, whether we plow on or whether we abandon and move. The noteworthy thing about conceptual innovators is that they have an idea, they do it, and they move on. No, it's the experimental innovator who's dogged, who's got self-doubt, who just continues to incrementally improve.
I'm just thinking of a conceptual innovator as like, if he's got his fundas together and he's going for and getting it, and it's successfully doing it, the level of confidence, and it's not just a question of, okay, I have these ideas, I know what will work, and this is the way I want to go. Like you said, they have it all clearly in their mind and then they execute. But it's also like experimental innovators have experienced a lot of self-doubt. I mean, is this correct? Is that correct?
Absolutely doubt. I mean, I think the Picasso Cézanne stories tell a lot because Picasso was very confident. He knew what he wanted to do. He says, that's it. That's great art. He would tell people. I decide that. Cézanne was never sure.
Yet you will say both are equally
Absolutely.
successful.
Look at the imprint they left on the world. Look at the imprint Cézanne left on the world. I read the quotes. Yeah. And in almost every discipline we have this. I mean, I didn't include this here. I did some anecdotal study of Indian film directors. Satyajit Ray and Rishikesh Mukherjee are contemporaries. Satyajit Ray had his golden years when he was in his 30s. He had the good fortune of being an assistant to, I forget the name of a French director, when he was in his 20s. So in his 30s, he produced his trilogy. Rishikesh Mukherjee slogged and slogged till he was in his 50s before he had Anand, Namak Haram, many others. But it took much longer for him to get what he was trying to say, what he was trying to tell. Again, you got to be ready to produce duds. The hard part of it for being a conceptual innovator, like I said with Fleetwood Mac, is the market may not give you a chance anymore. Yes?
Ram, is there a difference between creativity and innovation?
No, I think, as I said, I think of the terms as being saying the same things. You and I, there's a lot of books on what exactly is creativity. We can't reduce it to something that's so easily decipherable so that we can put it in a bottle so everybody could drink it and then have it. No, creativity is got to be something that's a little mysterious. It's embodied in an idea, a product, or a service. But yes, I'm using the term innovation and creativity as substitutes. Yes.
Do you think the two categories are watertight? Can a conceptual
I'm sorry.
Can a conceptual innovator later become an experimental innovator, or are the two categories watertight?
Oh, that's a great question. Wonderful question. Maybe he or she can. I think the conceptual innovator, I mean, humans morph, they change as they grow older. And they may begin, they're influenced by others around them. So I think it's entirely possible. What I'm doing is the way I'm surveying research in the field of economics. I don't tell you, here's what I think. Let's go look at the evidence. So yes, I think it's entirely possible. That's a great question. Yes?
Are you possibly conflating popularity with innovation?
No, popularity, that's why I said, it's a good question as well, to ask what is the dependent variable. So in Cézanne's case, in Gallinson's study, what he does is he says, let's look at art. Let's look at his most valuable art as measured by the market price. The market price is a signal of what the market thinks about a piece of art. You can also look at the number of illustrations in a textbook. Okay? But here's a very good point. We shouldn't think of something as a number of sort of likes on a social media page. We have to go something deeper than that to think about legacy and so on. So when you look at, for instance, I talked about Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles. Not only is it the critics, it's record sales, that's the equivalent of price as an index, or ratings on Billboard top 40s as a way of saying that is popularity. But you might say have a musician who's done some fantastic work and he or she may not be #1 in Billboard charts. That's fine, that's true. He or she belongs to a niche segment. That's possible. I'm not saying, it depends on how you want to measure it. But science doesn't say that. Okay.
For experimental innovators, is it like the more you do, the better you
That's
get?
exactly right. That is correct.
It's
You
the
get
mind,
better as you
body,
age.
Mind-body synthesis which coordinates to give you the best.
That's what
nature.
quality-
Like they say for a sitar player, 10,000 hours is the minimum that you have.
Yeah, that was Erickson's famous study on
Yeah.
pianists.
Yes.
That 10,000 hours would make you an expert.
Yeah.
You need 25,000 to be very good.
Yeah.
Okay? And of course, it's not just volume. It's deliberate practice.
It also becomes a part of what you are.
That's That's exactly right.
You, the
Yes.
number of hours you put into it.
Practice definitely matters. Other questions, thoughts?
Just a thought here. I mean, like each of the disciplines that we're talking about, whether it's filmmaking or literature, each one has their own, like, I mean, an exponent of that art form will tell you that this many hours had to be put in order to understand maybe the form and then the knowledge behind it, and then add your own experience to it. I feel that, I mean, some of the metrics that we have here are when they found fame and not necessarily their best work. And we sometimes confuse when somebody found
I think
fame.
this is the same question that we talked about. That's the question gentleman asked. So you can have multiple ways of interpreting what is a person's best work. So for instance, for the physicists, we said, what is the work for which they won the Nobel Prize? So the Nobel Committee said, we're giving Einstein the Nobel Prize for the work he did in 1906. Okay? So for Orson Welles, he won the Oscar in that's the only time he won it, in whatever, when he was 26 years old. So we're using a proxy measure. Is it a perfect one? No, that's the same question you're asking. And yes, we have to be careful to make sure we don't use the wrong one. Right, that's a good question.
Incidentally, Einstein didn't get it for his famous relativity. He got the Nobel Prize for what's called the photoelectric effect.
All done in 1906.
They are all, four of them, the four papers came
Yeah.
in the same year, 1905. But he didn't get it for, that was not one of the four. That was Brownian motion, special.
That's right, that's what I mentioned.
General relativity came later, but yeah.
Ram, is there any evidence to show that creativity and innovation is accelerating with time? And in this century, the volume of creativity is more than last century?
No, we don't have any evidence on that. We can't say that. Certainly more opportunities to do that, more self-awareness, more awareness of what it takes. But I don't have any evidence to show that we are more innovative today than we were a century ago. The truth is that empirical evidence is, we're only beginning to gather large amounts of data to be able to make more general statements. Yes?
This thing, there's a book by a person called Matt Ridley called The Rational Optimist that says that innovations are, going to kind of like Moore's law. They are expanding as more people are there and they're interacting. He uses the phrase that ideas are sex. They are multiplying based on how many interacting ideas there are. And therefore, so he believes that it is the case that innovation is.
I guess mine's answer was more conservative,
Right.
based on evidence. That's sort of not yet empirical evidence. I'm not saying that it's not general evidence, but I can't dispute that happens, yes. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? I'm happy to be here to take your questions. But it's 10 o'clock, so your last question.
Yes. Is there any reason why what is ignored today? What is what? The art of innovation only. Why what is omitted?
No, I mean, when I think about what you innovate, I didn't have anything to say about it empirically. I wanted to talk about these four things because I had some evidence to say about it. When you think about what is being innovated, I mean, that goes back to this question, what is innovation, right? So what is being innovated could be, I in fact talk about it in a roundabout way. I'm talking about musicians creating some music. But every one of us is also thinking about, why is it, did you say you're a photographer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why aren't you pole vaulting?
That's not my cup of tea.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You and I choose. We choose consciously sometimes. Sometimes things happen to us. In fact, more things happen to us than we choose. We must acknowledge that. Okay? But I'm saying that, you choose your field. Just like you said, it's not my cup of tea. You stay within an area that you're comfortable with. Okay? And when I say talk about accidents, I mean early in our lives we get stuck in a particular career, and before you know it, you got 10 years experience, and everybody says, that's who you are, you're a photographer. You can go and become a movie director, you're a photographer. Somebody else slots you. Okay, so Yeah, I think the evidence I had was, I was